Okay, live streaming on YouTube channel has started. Let's start with a new lecture of today. Today we will give you a brief overview concerning European policy and environmental impact assessment. So I will try to give you a kind of roadmap in order to make you able to find information concerning the policy that has been implemented by the European Union concerning environmental impact assessment. The lecture of today is devoted to European policy. Next lecture, what means on next Tuesday, I will talk particularly about Italian environmental policy. And this is why the next lecture will be devoted mostly to Italian students. But for foreign students, I think it is anyhow interesting to look at how the European policy has been implemented into our national legislation. And this gives the foreign students, so non-Italian students, the possibility or some hints on how to look at their own country legislation concerning environmental impact assessment and allow them to make some kind of comparisons between the way we have implemented this legislation in Italy and the legislation has been implemented in their own country. I recall you that the story of environmental impact assessment starts in 1969 with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, that is in the United States, that is the act that institutes the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. This act imposes the obligation to submit to environmental impact assessment, AEIA, all decisions of the federal government that may have significant effects on the environment. It recognizes the inadequacy of the cost-benefit analysis, and the environmental impact assessment is introduced to reconcile economic development and environmental protection. Just one moment. Oh, let me see if I can increase the volume of my speaker, because somebody is telling me that my voice is not very loud. So maybe like this it is a little bit better. I hope you can hear me better. Okay, so we were saying that it was recognized in the United States in 1969 that cost-benefit analysis was not enough, and it was required instead to have a much more sophisticated procedure, and this procedure is what we call environmental impact assessment procedures that we are studying in this class. I recall you also that in 1976, it were introduced in France, so in Europe, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, les études d'impact for operation that can have disruptive effects on the environment. So in the space of a decade, less than a decade, what it was implemented in the United States started to be implemented also in Europe. We had to wait until 1985 for a European community to adopt the first environmental impact assessment directive. Please be aware that this is a question for the oral exam. When was first introduced in the European legislation environmental impact assessment? The answer is directive number 337 of 1985. Environmental impact assessment of certain projects, public or private, certain projects without a much specifications on which projects. But in general, this directive institutes a framework law with organic and detailed disciplines, but only binds the states to achieve results and leaves them free to choose how to implement the directive, but anyhow should be implemented by year 1988. Then we have to wait until year 1997 for the very important second directive, directive number 11 of 1997, that introduces the screening phase. The screening phase is a phase that allows national member countries to select which process shall undergo an environmental impact assessment procedure. As I anticipated, environmental impact assessment is quite complex, time-consuming and costly procedure. So it is important to find, since the beginning, to select which projects are supposed to be undergo a complete environmental impact assessment procedure. So through the screening phase, it is asked to a competent authority if the viewed project should undergo environmental impact assessment or not. Then in 2001, it was issued a third directive that is another important step forward, that is called the Strategic Environmental Appraisal Directive, Directive number 42 of 2001, in which was introduced a different tool, the Strategic Environmental Appraisal procedure, that allows member states to decide which plans and planning and programming tools should undergo or should be implemented by an environmental impact assessment friendly strategy. So the third directive, the directive of year 2001, changes a little bit the time step, passing from tactic point of view, the tactic of the directive number 337, directive of year 1985, to a more strategic long-term perspective that is that expressed by directive number 42 of 2001. So under directive 337, we have the guidelines that allows us to select which projects should undergo environmental impact assessment and gives the baselines of these procedures, while we have to wait until year 2001 to find a more general procedure, more long-term procedure that decides which kind of general plans should be envisaged with an environmental impact assessment approach. So this is strategic environmental appraisal. Environmental impact assessment are projects. Strategic environmental appraisal are plans or programming tools. Of course, we are not only talking about environmental impact assessment, like it is stated by directive number 337 of 1985 on environmental impact assessment of certain public and private projects, that was modified by directive number 11 1997. But we have also some more sophisticated or more specific tools that were introduced, in particular in 1996, directive number 61, Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control, or IPPC directive, that applies particularly to industries, to productive plants or productive facilities. So this has to do with industrial production. IPPC has to do with industries, but it is environmental impact assessment applied to industrial plants or to industrial facilities. And then some more general tools like what I've already said, Strategic Environmental Appraisal, Directive number 42 of 2001 on the environmental impact assessment of certain plans and programs. So the difference is between projects, the directive on 1985, and programs and plans with directive of 2001. Programs and plans, for example, urban planning tool is a typical plans, but should undergo strategic environmental appraisal. And then we have more specific directives, like, for example, the incidence directives of year 1992, number 43, concerning the conservation of natural and semi-natural habitats and the flora and fauna. So this is the so-called Habitat Directive, in which specifically some particularly endangered habitats are considered or are thought to be protective against environmental impact. So this is the Incidence Evaluation Directive that we will discuss by the end of this class. The incidence evaluation is referred to also as the Habitat Directive, as we will see also the BERS Directive comes into play when drafting the new versions of the Incidence Evaluation Directive. Okay. Environmental impact assessment is an ancient as well as a modern tool. It is ancient because it is introduced as early as in 1985 in Europe, but also earlier in France and in the United States. And it is also the precursor of an impressive production of environmental legislation during the last 30 years. I will try to give you today a short overview, a brief overview of this impressive environmental legislation production. It is a modern tool because it is based on a global, holistic approach. It is based on a prevention principle, and it anticipates in 85 all the more particular directives like IPPC and Strategic Environmental Appraisal that were issued in 96 and in 2001. So it is simultaneously an ancient and a modern tool. What are the definitive characters of environmental impact assessment? First of all, we may recognize that environmental impact assessment has a preventive character and integrates the tools of environmental auditing. Environmental auditing were a set of tools that were developed between the 80s and the 90s in order to make assessments of environmental friendliness of certain productive processes. Environmental impact assessment uses a global approach, considers the following factors: atmosphere, aquatic environment, soil, subsoil, flora, fauna, ecosystem as a whole, public health, noise, vibration, ionizing and non-ionizing radiations, but also includes, sorry, because I have to admit somebody, but also includes cultural heritage and their integration. So we will see that under environmental impact assessment procedures, also matters linked to culture, cultural heritage, landscape, but also economic, socioeconomic processes on values may be included. Environmental impact assessment is an administrative procedure which represents the real conflicting interests concerning in the public decision. So, as it is always customary in public decisions, are always present some kind of conflicting interest, up to a certain extent conflicting interest. Environmental impact assessment procedure try to solve these conflicts or to find the best solution in order to compete with these conflicts. In particular, this procedure involves mass participation, and as I already told you, this is really innovative. I cannot recall any other legislatory or norming effort that includes in such an explicit way the participation of public in form of promoter, designer, but drafter of environmental impact studies, the administration, and the public. So there are several subjects that are involved in the decision at large, and in particular among the subjects, the public. And this is really very innovative. So if I shall ask you what is innovative in environmental impact assessment legislation as drafted in the directive of 1985, you should say that at least one of the aspects is the involvement of the public in an explicit way. The environmental impact assessment procedure is a technical scientific tool, but not only. During the cognitive phase is a technical elaboration with a kind of prognostic view of the project data design. So we implement the project data design and we try to build scenarios that may provide us prognostic views of the future. In the decision phase, so during the, if you want, administrative phase of the decision making, the judgment retains, of course, a set of discretional traits, but are confirmed by the planned participation of the public. So, of course, as always happens in this kind of decision processes, there is a kind of discretional level, certain level of discretion, or if you want, subjective traits. But the environmental impact assessment procedure we are describing and introducing now tries to make more consistent. Let's give a look more closely to the meaning of the words. The term environmental impact assessment is, we may say, a conceptual wrapper that lends itself to retain, even under the same label, very heterogeneous tools. So we have seen environmental impact assessment procedures, strictly speaking, but also strategic environmental appraisal, also integrated pollution prevention and control, also incidence evaluation, and so on. Evaluation of what? Evaluation of what nature, what type of evaluation, on what criteria is based, when to do this evaluation, which authority is competent, and which are the aims and to which goals. These are all questions at which we shall try to answer now. Impact. We already introduced the concept of impact. Which effects are part of the impact concept? On what factors should be considered the impact? What size of the impact is relevant? In terms of environment, we may say which has to be considered natural, which has to be considered anthropic, and which has to be considered as socioeconomic. So we see we have several ways, several objectives or classifications of the impacts. Impacts have effects, are acting on some factors, typically environmental factors, or what we may call environmental components. Impacts may be extensive or limited in time and space. Impacts may be on the natural environment, on the anthropic environment or on the socio-economic structures. What are the aims of a procedure? The environmental impact assessment will identify, describe, and evaluate the effects of a project on the various environmental factors described. Environmental impact assessment procedure identifies and describes the current status. So we look at the environment as it is now, and the environmental impact assessment tries also to describe to assess the project status. So we may say that environmental impact assessment is based on a kind of prognosis of possible perturbative effects of the initial environmental situation generated by the project. So you understand why, for example, in the environmental study, as we seen last week, on last Tuesday, there is also the need of describing the status quo of the environmental as a starting point for evaluating environmental impact assessment. The environmental impact assessment has not the rigidly conservative function of avoiding any possible environmental change. It is clear that we do not want to stop development in general. Environmental impact assessment has a productivity perspective, but seeks to reduce potential damages caused by the project. So what we want to implement projects, we want to ensure development, but we want to do that by ensuring a sustainable approach. Losses that do not exceed the environmental quality standards are always acceptable. So you see that the environmental impact assessor is already prone to accept some kind of losses if they do not exceed the environmental quality standards. The purpose of environmental impact assessment is so to reconcile the demands of economic and productive development with those of environmental heritage through a choice of compromise. The key word here is compromise. We look for an acceptable compromise for economical, social development with environmental protection. This is another way, if you want to recast the concept of sustainability. Now let's give a little bit more detail concerning which are the projects to be subjected to environmental impact assessment. We shall start reading the directives, in particular the directives of 1985 number 337 and the directives of 1997 number 11. This directive concerns the environmental impact assessment of projects that can have an important environmental impact. The integration of 1970 comes to significant impact. So in the beginning of the story of environmental impact assessment directive, we talked about important environmental impact. And then in the subsequent directive, we substituted the concept of important to the concepts of significant. So significant means impacts that are appreciable or impacts that may be somehow measured. So these are only significant impact, appreciable impact, and not only important. Important is too generic. The types of projects to be submitted to environmental impact assessment is contained, as always, in the annexes to the directive, in particular Annex 1 and Annex 2, in which are discussed the characteristics, size, and location of planned works. In particular, these last aspects are discussed in detail in Annex 3, as it is always the case with legislation text or normative text. The important parts are always in the annexes in which you have numbers and directives or guidelines on how to implement the legislative efforts. Do you have any questions? Okay, let's go on. Go. Directive 85 and Directive 97. Sorry, Directive of year 85 and Directive of year 97. So the directives number 337 and number 11. In particular, Article 3 defines the components of the impact. So we start going more in details with the guidelines on how to define impact. Article 4 defines the project to be submitted to environmental impact assessment. In particular, in Annex 1 of the Directive 337, there is a list of projects that are mandatory, so they should undergo environmental impact assessment mandatorily, while in Annex 2 there is a list of projects that may be left to the discretionality of member states in order to be submitted to environmental impact assessment. As I told you, the process is very cumbersome, very complex, very time and money consuming. So there is an effort in the legislation to try to select only those projects that are very important in terms of environmental impact assessment. Annex 1 and Annex 2 essentially refers on the size of a project, on the location of a project, and on the typology or techniques or types of processes that are involved into the project. So according to these characteristics, to these characters, there are a draft of list of projects that should be mandatorily sent to environmental impact assessment, and some process in which the environmental impact assessment procedure is left to the discretionality of member states. Article 5 starts describing the contents of environmental impact study. In particular, this is drafted more explicitly in Annex 3, and Article 6 deals with the participation, so deals to the procedures that should ensure public participation. As an anticipation, in national Italian regulation, we have the first implementation of a European directive in year 1986 by law number 349, which addressed the issues in very general terms, leaving the definition of the details to subsequent legislation. Important to remember, law number 349, 1986 is the law that institutes what is nowadays the mother of all competent authorities in environmental matters, that is the Ministry of Environment. This is a very short summary of national Italian regulations. So as I told you, 1986, Law 349, Instituzione of the Ministry of Environment, and these are very general norms. Then we have the first issuing of a coordinated text that is updated by Law 3 August 1999 and so on. We have a DPCM in 1988 that gives some regulation and pronounces of environmental compatibility. And then we had to wait until year 2006 to have law 152, that is the framework law for environmental issues in Italy. In Italy, all the environmental matters are normed according to law number 152. So 152, 2006 is the Bible for the environmental engineer in Italy. I suggest for foreign students to look to their national legislation and to find the equivalent of Law 152 in their specific national legislation. And as I anticipated, several refinements of the procedure have been implemented in 1988, for example, DPCM number 20, DPCM of 27 December 1988, or the law of 7th of August 1990, and so on. Here again, you have another set of laws, 1994, 1996, 1997. Here you have some links, hyperlinks to the text of the law. This is particularly of interest for Italian students, so they have a quick reference to the laws. We go quite quickly here. 1999. This is just for Italian students, but just to illustrate how significant is the production of normative or legislative texts that has followed by the implementation of the 1985 directive. And as I anticipated, we go on until 2006. Here, that is the reference text for environmental framework text for environmental issues in Italy. Of course, the text was not concluded in 2006, so we had some subsequent amendments in the following years. So now the reference text is that of 2008. So for as a kind of route or guideline or guidance, we start in 1986, establishment of a Ministry of Environment. We switch in 1988, in which we have some regulation of the implementation of directives of Law 349. And in 1988, with the 27th December decree of the President of the Council of Ministers, environmental impact studies are described here. So you see, you should at least have a reference, these three law texts as a reference, but as I told you, these three law texts end up with law 152, 2006, and subsequent amendments, in particular those of year 2008. In particular, for Italian students, it is of relevance connecting the development of this law framework with the framework law on public works, the so-called Legge Merloni in Italy, that was issued in 1994, and that is a regulation concerning the works implemented by public authorities. During the project phase, it is a preliminary schedule that is subjected to environmental impact assessment according to Law 377, and the final level at which it should be made the environmental impact studies. So the environmental impact study should be developed at the level of the executive project. We have an integration to this law with the DPR 554 of year 1999, implementing the regulation of Merloni's law. There is a clarification, a preliminary schedule that is subject to environmental pre-feasibility study, while the true environmental impact assessment procedure should be carried during the final study. So the moment in which you are ready to build the executive project. This was made because in Italy we have a kind of wonderful toolkit that is maybe called in Italian varianti in corso d'opera, or in English variations during the implementations, that made dramatically a way of turning around the issues given by the Merloni laws of 94. So, according to the Merloni laws of 94, the varianti in corso d'opera or variation during implementation were not even cited or considered, while the law 554 1999 clarifies that the environmental impact assessment should be carried only in the case in which the variation in corso d'opera or the variation in implementation are not admitted because we are already in the executive phase. So this is a procedural issue that is of particular relevance for Italian engineers. What are the stages of environmental impact assessment procedure? We may identify three main stages: an introductory stages, an inquiry stages, and the decisory stages. Throughout the whole environmental impact assessment process must be maintained a relationship of informations or a constant exchange of informations between authorities and the public who need to express opinions on various parts of the process and of the project. So, as we will see, it is explicitly clarified in the laws, first in the directive, and then in the implementation in national legislation, which are the steps that ensure participation of the public. Through a transversal reading of the three regulatory acts of 1986 and 1988, we may identify involved subjects. First of all, the developer, that may be public or private, starts the procedure. So it is you, the environmental engineer, but normally is following an implementation of a project and is following the environmental impact assessment procedure and initiates the procedure. As I already anticipated, regional legislation, in particular Veneto regional legislation, distinguish between the developer and the proposing authority. The developer typically is a private, so for example, an engineer or a study of engineers that wants to implement some kind of construction, while the proposer is a public authority. The authorities are those that emanate the judgment concerning the environmental compatibility of the project. Typically, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Heritage and Culture, Ministry, Council of Ministers, and so on. So the authorities are those charged of issuing the ending of the procedures. In particular, the environmental impact assessment procedure should end. Sorry, I have to make a correction. Oops. should end with a judgment of environmental compatibility. Of course, I made an error because in English judgment is written with a J. Sorry. Okay. So when I ask you what is the endpoint of an environmental impact assessment procedure, the endpoint is the emanation of a judgment of environmental compatibility of the project that is issued by the competent authority. Typically, the competent authority in Italy is the Minister of Environment or the Minister of Heritage and Culture and so on. Then another important competent authority is the so-called the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission. The Environmental Impact Assessment Commission is the commission that is charged of instructing the procedure. So evaluates the programmatic framework, the project files, and the environmental effects. Typically, the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission is built up by local government, regions. The relevant regions shall be heard by the Environment Ministry, but also any citizen or any public subject may interact with the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission because of the participatory nature of the procedure that can produce. These citizens and public subjects can produce any instances, requests, comments, or opinion. So, at least in Italy, I don't know in other states, but I think it is similar. In Italy, after the institution of the Ministry of Environment, it was clarified that we needed a commission that was charged of instructing all the procedures of environmental impact assessment. This commission is called the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission. We have two levels of this commission in Italy. We have a national commission and we have a regional commission. If we look, for example, at Law 67, 1988, in which there are some specifications on how to build this commission. The commission was initially built up, composed by 35 members, besides the president, and the president is customarily the Ministry of Environment. The members are chosen among university professors, professionals, and experts skilled in design, environmental issue, economic and legal discipline. And then any government and public administration executives. For environmental impact assessment of infrastructure and settlement, where it has been recognized in the agreement a shared regional interest, the board is supplemented by members nominated by the regions or autonomous provinces that are involved in the processes. This means that in case the project involved, for example, in Italy, more than one region, every region has the opportunity of supplementing the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission with some representatives. In the framework law of environment, law number 152, 2006, the commission has been revised. So we have a single commission for strategic environmental applied environmental impact assessment and integrated pollution prevention and control procedure. The commission is made up of 78 members, including the president and 3 vice presidents chosen among university professors, professional qualified experts, as well as between government executives and so on. The commission works in subcommittees, eventually supplemented by regional representatives. For example, we will have one commission, one subcommittee in the Environmental Impact Assessment Commission that will be charged of strategic environmental appraisal, one subcommittee that will be charged of integrated pollution prevention control, and so on. So this is how the requirement of laws have been implemented in Italy. By year 2008, we have a simplification of the Commission. So the Commission was explicitly subdivided into 3 subcommissions, one for environmental impact assessment, one for spatial environmental impact assessment, what in Italy is called grandi opere. So it is a way of implementing the objective law number 443, 2001. This grandi opere means buildings that are thought to be strategic for economic development of a country, and another commission that is charged for strategic environmental appraisal. For the regional commissions, we have a regional law number 10, 1999, that defines a commission that is chaired by the regional secretary of environment, that is the regional equivalent of the Ministry of Environment, the regional manager responsible of environmental impact assessment, the regional agency for the protection of environment, ARPAV, its director or any delegate, the DAPs of the ARPAV. DAPs are the provincial sub commissions of the regional authority for the protection of environment, and provincial executive manager and 9 experts. This is the regional law, but now we are discussing the national law. Okay, for nowadays, I will stop here because we are becoming a little bit, we are coming too much details, and we will have a time of discussing these details starting from next week. I stop here now. Do you have any questions? If you don't have any questions, I stay in the class for 10 more minutes, and then I close the classroom.